The blood on his shirt had dried to rust before Kieran Tate rode into Great Bend, Kansas. And even then, nobody in town could tell if it was his or someone else's. It was the summer of 1878, and the air hung heavy with dust and the promise of storms that never came, the kind of heat that made men mean and women desperate. But Kieran just kept his head down and his hat lower, that scar running from his left temple to his jaw catching the light like a fault line in weathered stone. He tied his horse outside the boarding house on Main Street, his movements careful and deliberate, the way a man moves when every breath costs him something. And he didn't look at anyone as he pushed through the door into the dim coolness of the entryway. The woman behind the counter had hair the color of wheat just before harvest, pulled back in a practical bun that couldn't quite contain the rebellious strands that framed her face. Natalie Kane looked up from her ledger, pencil poised, and found herself staring at the stranger in a way that would have embarrassed her if she'd had time to think about it. She was 23 years old and had been running this boarding house for 2 years, since her father took sick and died, leaving her with a building full of empty rooms and a reputation for being too particular about her tenants. Most women in Great Bend thought she should have married by now, should have accepted one of the handful of proposals from storekeepers or ranch hands, but Natalie had seen what marriage did to most women in this town, had watched them shrink into themselves year by year, and she decided that loneliness was preferable to that particular kind of disappearing. "I need a room," Kieran said, and his voice was rough from disuse, like he hadn't spoken to another soul in days or maybe weeks. "Got money to pay for a month up front." She should have said yes immediately. The boarding house had 6 rooms and only 2 were occupied, and a month's rent would solve a dozen problems that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and calculating how long she could keep the place running. But something about him made her hesitate, made her look closer at the set of his shoulders and the careful way he kept his left side angled away from her. And she realized he was hurt, that the blood on his shirt probably was his after all. "You need a doctor," she said instead of quoting him a price. "I need a room. We have a good doctor in town, Doc Henderson. He is just 2 streets over and he would not ask questions if you do not want him to." Kieran's jaw tightened, and she saw the scar pull against his skin, saw the way it must have been made by something sharp and deliberate, not the clean line of a knife fight but something worse. "Madam, I just need a room. I can pay double if that is what you are asking." Natalie set down her pencil and came around the counter, and she was tall for a woman, nearly 5'8", and she looked him straight in the eye when she said, "I am not asking for more money. I am telling you that you look like you are about to fall over, and I do not want you dying in one of my rooms because then I would have to explain it to the sheriff, and he is already suspicious of me for running this place alone." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Kieran's face, gone so quick she almost missed it. "Fair enough. But I have had worse than this and lived, so if you will just show me to a room, I will make sure not to die in it." She studied him for another long moment, this stranger with his scarred face and his careful movements, and something in his eyes that made her chest feel tight, something that looked like the same loneliness she saw in her own mirror every morning. Then she took a key from the board behind the counter and gestured for him to follow her up the narrow stairs to the 2nd floor. She gave him the room at the end of the hall, the one with the best cross breeze and the window that looked out over the little garden she'd been trying to cultivate in the small patch of earth behind the building. "Breakfast is at 7, dinner at 6, she said, unlocking the door. "There is a bathing room at the end of the hall and I change the water every day. Clean linens once a week, more often if you need them." Kieran nodded, pulling a roll of bills from his pocket and counting out what she would charge for a month, then adding several more. She started to protest, but he cut her off. For any trouble I might cause, and for not asking questions. Their fingers brushed when she took the money, and she felt calluses rough as tree bark, felt the heat of his skin even through her own work-hardened hands. She stepped back quickly, professionally, and told herself the flutter in her stomach was just surprise, just the strangeness of having a new tenant after so many weeks of empty rooms. "If you change your mind about the doctor, just let me know," she said. And then she left him there, closing the door behind her and standing in the hallway for a moment, listening to the sound of him moving around inside, the creak of the bed frame as he sat down, the long exhale that spoke of pain held carefully in check. She went back downstairs and tried to focus on her ledger, on the neat columns of numbers that never quite added up to enough. But her mind kept drifting back to the man upstairs, to the scar that ran down his face like a river, and the shadows in his eyes that suggested he'd seen things she couldn't imagine. Great Bend was a small town, peaceful by the standards of Kansas in 1878, far enough from the cattle trails that they didn't get much trouble from drovers, close enough to the railroad that they had regular supplies, and a sense of being connected to the wider world. Strangers came through occasionally, but most of them were traveling salesmen or families heading further west, and they never stayed long. This man, though, this Kieran Tate, he'd paid for a month, and something told her he meant to use every day of it. 3 days passed before she saw him again. She left his meals outside his door, breakfast and dinner both, and the trays were always empty when she came back to collect them. But he never came down to the dining room where her other 2 tenants ate, never emerged for anything she could see. On the 4th morning, she knocked on his door with his breakfast tray balanced on one hip, and when he didn't answer, she knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Tate, I am coming in," she called, because she'd learned that announcing her intentions was the best way to avoid surprising armed men, and she had no doubt this particular man was armed. She turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open slowly, giving him time to protest or tell her to go away, but there was only silence. He was lying on the bed, still fully clothed except for his boots, and his skin had taken on an unhealthy gray pallor that made the scar stand out even more starkly. The bandage she could see peeking out from under his shirt was stained with fresh blood, and she knew immediately that whatever wound he'd been nursing had gotten worse instead of better. "Mr. Tate," she said firmly, setting down the tray and crossing to the bed. "Kieran." His eyes opened slowly, and she could see the fever in them, the glassy brightness that meant infection had set in. "I am fine," he mumbled, which was such an obvious lie that she almost laughed. "You are burning up and that wound is infected. I am getting Doc Henderson." His hand shot out and caught her wrist, and even weakened by fever, his grip was strong. "No, doctor. They ask questions. They report to the law. Doc Henderson is not like that. He treated half the outlaws who came through here during the war and never said a word to anyone. Cannot risk it." His eyes were pleading now, and she saw something in them that made her hesitate, something that looked like genuine fear. She pulled her wrist free gently. "Then let me help. I am not a doctor, but I have treated enough injuries to know the basics. My father was shot twice before he died of consumption, and I kept him alive both times until he healed." Kieran stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his options, calculating whether he could trust her or whether he had any choice. Finally, he nodded, just the smallest dip of his chin, and let his head fall back against the pillow. "I need to see the wound," she said, and he nodded again, reaching up with shaking hands to unbutton his shirt. She helped him, her fingers quick and efficient, pushing the fabric aside to reveal a bullet wound in his left shoulder, angry and red and weeping pus. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but the wound hadn't been cleaned properly, and infection had set in with a vengeance. "This is going to hurt," she warned, and then she went to work. She brought up hot water and clean cloths, carbolic acid that made him hiss between his teeth when she poured it over the wound, and her own needle and thread to close up the places where the flesh had started to tear. He bore it all in silence, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping, his hands fisted in the sheets, but he didn't cry out, didn't tell her to stop. When she was finished, she bandaged him properly and made him drink willow bark tea for the fever, then sat in the chair by the window while he drifted in and out of consciousness. She told herself she was just making sure he didn't take a turn for the worse, that any responsible boarding house owner would do the same, but the truth was she couldn't seem to make herself leave. There was something about him that called to her, something beyond the obvious danger and the mysterious circumstances that had brought him to Great Bend. She found herself studying the lines of his face when his eyes were closed, the way the scar changed the landscape of his features without making him ugly, just making him look lived in, like a man who'd earned every year of his life. When evening came, she finally forced herself to go downstairs and prepare dinner for her other tenants, an elderly widow named Mrs. Patterson, and a young clerk named James who worked at the Mercantile. They asked about the new tenant, and she told them he was ill but recovering, and that satisfied their curiosity for the moment. After they'd eaten and retired to their rooms, she made a plate for Kieran and carried it upstairs, letting herself into his room with the same careful announcement as before. He was awake, sitting up against the headboard, and though he still looked pale, the worst of the fever seemed to have broken. "Thank you," he said when she set the plate on the table beside the bed, "for today, for not calling the law. Are they looking for you?" She asked because if she was going to harbor a fugitive, she figured she deserved to know what she was getting into. He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Not anymore. Or at least, they should not be. I did not do what they thought I did, but I could not stay around to prove it. What did they think you did? There was a bank robbery in Dodge City 2 months ago. 3 men, all wearing dusters and bandanas. I was in town that day, and I happened to be wearing a duster because it had been raining, and one of the witnesses said one of the robbers had a scar on his face. He touched the mark absently, like he'd forgotten it was there until someone reminded him. The sheriff decided that was enough to lock me up, and I knew if I stayed in that cell, I would hang whether I was guilty or not. So I left. You broke out of jail." It should have frightened her, should have sent her running for the actual sheriff, but instead she just felt a strange sense of vindication, like she'd known all along he was running from something but had chosen to trust him anyway. "I did. And I have been moving ever since, staying ahead of anyone who might recognize me, trying to get far enough away that I can start over somewhere." He looked at her directly then, and she saw the honesty in his eyes, the quiet desperation of a man who'd been pushed past his limits. "I am not a bank robber, Miss Kane. I am just a man who had bad luck and a memorable face." She believed him. Maybe she was a fool for it. Maybe she'd regret it later, but sitting there in the fading light with this stranger who'd trusted her enough to tell the truth, she believed every word. "How did you get the scar?" she asked, and she saw him flinch, saw the way his whole body went tense. "That is a longer story," he said quietly, "and not one I am ready to tell yet." "Fair enough." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "You should eat and then rest. I will check on you in the morning." Over the next 2 weeks, Kieran healed. Slowly at first, and then with gathering strength, until he was able to move around without pain lancing through his shoulder, able to come downstairs for meals and sit in the parlor in the evenings. Natalie watched him integrate himself into the small world of the boarding house, saw how he was polite but distant with Mrs. Patterson, how he helped James carry heavy boxes from the mercantile without being asked, how he was always ready with a hand when she needed help moving furniture or reaching something on a high shelf. They didn't talk much at first, just exchanged pleasantries and practical information. But there was something growing between them, something that made her aware of him in a way she'd never been aware of anyone else. She found herself listening for his footsteps on the stairs, found herself looking up whenever he entered a room, found herself staying up later than she should just because he liked to sit in the parlor after everyone else had gone to bed, reading whatever books she had on her shelves by lamplight. One evening, 3 weeks after he'd arrived, she came downstairs to find him still awake, a volume of poetry open on his lap. She'd been planning to just get a glass of water and go back to bed, but something made her pause in the doorway, made her say, "You are a reader." He looked up, and she saw surprise in his eyes, like he hadn't expected her to be there. "My mother taught me when I was young. She said a man who could read would never be poor because he would always have worlds to escape to. She sounds wise." Natalie came into the room and sat in the chair across from him, tucking her feet under her nightgown. She knew it wasn't proper, being alone with a man in her nightclothes, but it was her house, and besides, she was tired of always doing what was proper. She was. She died when I was 15. Cholera epidemic. I am sorry. She meant it, felt the weight of those words the way she always did when someone spoke of losing people they loved. My mother died when I was 12. She was thrown from a horse. They sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd learned too young that the world could take away what you loved without warning or mercy. Then Kieran said, "You run this place well. Your father would be proud." "I hope so. He wanted me to sell it after he died, wanted me to use the money to go back east, maybe live with his sister in Philadelphia. But I could not do it. This place, this town, it is all I know. And besides, I am not sure I would fit in Philadelphia." "Why not?" she laughed, a little self-conscious. "I am too plain-spoken, too used to taking care of things myself. Eastern ladies are supposed to be delicate and decorative, and I am neither of those things." Kieran looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that made her skin feel warm. "You are wrong about being plain. And delicate is overrated. I would take capable over decorative any day." She felt her cheeks flush and looked away, suddenly flustered in a way she hadn't been since she was 16 and thought she was in love with the preacher's son. "That is kind of you to say. It is true." He closed the book and set it aside. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you help me? When I first arrived, you could have turned me away, you could have called the sheriff, but you did not." Natalie considered the question, tried to find words for something she didn't fully understand herself. "I suppose I saw something in you that reminded me of myself. You looked like someone who was tired of running but did not know how to stop. And I know what that feels like, even if I have never run anywhere. Sometimes staying in one place and trying to hold everything together takes just as much courage as running does." He nodded slowly, like she'd said something profound, and then he stood, moving to the window to look out at the dark street. "The scar," he said quietly, and she knew without him explaining that he was finally ready to tell her the story. "I got it 5 years ago. I was working on a ranch in Texas, breaking horses, and there was this one stallion that nobody could gentle. Beautiful animal, black as midnight, but mean. The owner wanted to sell him, but I convinced him to give me a chance to work with him first. I spent weeks earning his trust, getting him used to the saddle, and I thought I had him. But one day something spooked him, a rattlesnake maybe, and he reared up and his hoof caught me right across the face, split it open from temple to jaw. Natalie stood and crossed to where he was standing, close enough that she could see the way his hand had unconsciously moved to touch the scar, tracing its path the way he must have done 1,000 times before. "Did you gentle the horse?" she asked. "I did. Took another month after I healed, but I got him to trust me again, and when the owner sold him, I made sure he went to someone who would treat him right." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his face, made him look younger and less haunted. "I am stubborn that way. I am beginning to see that." She reached up without thinking, her hand moving of its own accord, and touched the scar where it curved along his cheekbone. His skin was warm under her fingertips, rougher than she'd expected, and she felt him go very still, felt the way he stopped breathing for just a moment. Kieran had spent 5 years flinching away from people who stared at his face, 5 years of seeing pity or disgust or fear in their eyes when they looked at him. He'd learned to turn his scarred side away from strangers, learned to keep his head down and his hat brim low, learned to expect the worst from every interaction. But Natalie was looking at him like the scar was just another part of him, no more remarkable than the color of his eyes or the shape of his mouth, and her touch was gentle, curious, without any of the hesitation he'd come to expect. He forgot to flinch. He forgot to turn away. He just stood there, frozen, while she traced the line of the scar from his temple down to his jaw, her fingers light as butterfly wings, and he felt something crack open inside his chest, some wall he'd built to keep himself safe. "It does not make you less," she said softly. "It just makes you more yourself." He caught her hand in his, held it against his face, and for a moment they just stood there in the lamplight, two people who'd been alone for too long suddenly finding themselves not alone anymore. Then he lowered her hand, but he didn't let go, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that was almost unconscious. "Natalie," he said, and her name in his rough voice sent shivers down her spine. "I should tell you that I am not planning to stay forever. I cannot. Eventually, someone will recognize me, or word will travel, and I will have to move on. I know." And she did know, had known from the first moment she saw him that he was temporary, that whatever was growing between them had an expiration date built in. But knowing that, and accepting it were two different things, and she found that she didn't want to accept it at all. "But while I am here," he continued, and now he was looking at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing in the sun, "I would like to spend as much time with you as you will allow, if that is something you would want." She should have said no. She should have protected herself, should have kept the distance that would make it hurt less when he eventually left. But she'd spent her whole life being careful, being responsible, being the good daughter who took care of her father and the good businesswoman who ran her boarding house and never caused a scandal. And for once, just this once, she wanted to be reckless. "Yes," she said. "That is something I would want." His smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture that was old-fashioned and courtly and made her feel like she was living in one of the romance novels she kept hidden in her bedroom. Then he released her and stepped back, giving her space, giving her time to change her mind. But she didn't change her mind. She said goodnight and went upstairs and lay in her bed staring at the ceiling, her hand still tingling from where he'd kissed it, her whole body thrumming with something that felt like hope and fear and anticipation all mixed together. The next morning, she woke early and made breakfast with extra care, frying eggs and bacon, baking fresh biscuits, even putting wildflowers in a jar on the table. Mrs. Patterson noticed and made a comment about how cheerful she seemed, and Natalie just smiled and changed the subject. When Kieran came down, she felt her heart do something complicated in her chest, felt herself blushing for no reason except that he was there, and he was looking at her like she was something precious. They fell into a routine after that. Kieran started helping around the boarding house, fixing things that had been broken for months, things Natalie hadn't had the time or the skill to repair herself. He mended the front steps that had been sagging, replaced broken shingles on the roof, even built her a proper chicken coop in the back so she could keep laying hens. In exchange, she taught him things he'd never learned, growing up without a mother, and then spending his adult life moving from place to place. She taught him how to bake bread, how to mend his own clothes so the stitches didn't show, how to make a room feel like home with just small touches here and there. They talked for hours, sitting in the parlor or out in the garden, and she learned that he was 27 years old, that he'd been born in Missouri and moved west with his father after his mother died, that he had a gift for working with animals but had never stayed anywhere long enough to build a real career out of it. He learned that she'd once wanted to be a teacher but had given up that dream when her father got sick, that she loved poetry and hated sewing, that she could shoot a rifle better than most men in Great Bend, but had never told anyone because she didn't want to seem unladylike. "I would like to see you shoot," Kieran said one evening when they were sitting on the back steps watching the sun set. "I bet you are magnificent." "I am fairly good," she admitted. "My father taught me when I was young. He said every woman in Kansas should know how to protect herself." Smart man. He was. She leaned back on her hands, tilting her face up to catch the last rays of sunlight. "Sometimes I miss him so much it feels like I cannot breathe. And then sometimes days go by and I forget to think about him at all, and I feel guilty for that." Kieran reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. They'd been doing that more and more lately, finding excuses to touch, to be close, testing the boundaries of what was growing between them. "I think that is how grief works. It comes and goes like the tide. And I think your father would not want you to feel guilty for living your life." "Maybe," she squeezed his hand. "What about you? Do you miss your parents every day? But especially my mother. She would have liked you, I think." "She always said I should find a woman who was smart and strong, someone who would challenge me instead of just agreeing with everything I said." "Did you ever come close? To finding someone, I mean." He shook his head. "There have been women here and there, but nothing serious. I think I always knew I was not in a place where I could offer anyone a real future, and it did not seem fair to ask someone to build a life with a man who was always looking over his shoulder." "Is that what you are doing now? Looking over your shoulder?" "Less than I was," he admitted. "I have been in Great Bend for almost 2 months now and no one has recognized me. No wanted posters have shown up. No strange lawmen asking questions. It is starting to feel like maybe I actually got away, like maybe I can stop running." Hope flared in Natalie's chest, bright and painful. "And if you did, if you could stop running, what would you do?" He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. "I think I would stay right here. I would find work, maybe at one of the ranches outside town, or maybe I could start my own horse training business. I would court you properly, the way you deserve to be courted. And if you would have me, I would marry you and spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy." It was the most he'd said about the future since he'd arrived, the first time he'd allowed himself to imagine a life beyond just surviving. Natalie felt tears prick her eyes, felt something enormous and terrifying and wonderful swelling in her chest. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like that very much." He cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms rough against her cheeks, and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, like he was afraid she might pull away, but she didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and kissed him back with all the longing and loneliness and hope she'd been carrying inside her for years. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, and it sounded like a confession, like something he'd been holding back but couldn't contain anymore. "I know it is too soon, and I know I have no right to say it when I cannot promise you anything, but I love you, Natalie." "It is not too soon," she said fiercely. "And you have every right. I love you too, Kieran. I think I have loved you since the day you walked into my boarding house looking like you were going to collapse, but too stubborn to admit it." He laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, full of joy and relief and the kind of happiness that comes from finally being seen by someone who matters. They sat there on the back steps as the sun went down and the stars came out, holding each other, making plans that felt more real than any plans she'd made in years. Summer turned to fall in Great Bend, and Kieran found work at the Thompson Ranch, 5 miles outside of town. Old man Thompson was skeptical at first, but after watching Kieran work with a particularly difficult mare for all of 10 minutes, he hired him on the spot and offered him better wages than any of his other hands. Kieran moved out of the boarding house and into the bunkhouse on the ranch, but he came into town every Sunday, and he and Natalie would spend the whole day together, walking by the river or having picnics, or just sitting in the parlor talking while she did her mending, and he read aloud from whatever book she'd selected for him. People in Great Bend started to notice, of course. It was a small town, and a scarred stranger courting the boarding house owner was exactly the kind of thing that got talked about. Most people were kind about it, or at least not actively cruel, but there were a few who made comments about Natalie settling for damaged goods, about how she could do better if she just tried. She heard those comments and ignored them, because what did they know about what she needed or wanted? What did they know about the way Kieran looked at her like she was a miracle, or the way he made her laugh, or the way he treated her like an equal partner instead of a fragile ornament in October? They went to the town dance together, their first truly public appearance as a couple. Natalie wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and Kieran wore new clothes he'd bought with his ranch wages, and they danced every dance together, scandalizing the more conservative members of Great Bend society but delighting everyone else. Mrs. Patterson told Natalie she looked radiant, and young James from the Mercantile told Kieran he was a lucky man, and by the end of the evening, even the people who'd been gossiping had to admit they'd rarely seen two people more obviously in love. That night, walking back to the boarding house under a sky full of stars, Kieran stopped in the middle of the street and pulled Natalie into his arms. "Marry me," he said, and it wasn't a question so much as a plea. "I know I should wait. I know I should save up for a proper ring and ask your permission more formally, but I cannot wait, Natalie. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life loving you." She didn't hesitate. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, and she clung to his shoulders and laughed with him, dizzy with joy and the sheer impossibility of it all. 6 months ago, she'd been alone and convinced she'd always be alone, and now she was engaged to a man who loved her, who saw her, who wanted to build a future with her. They were married in November, in the small church on the edge of town. It was a simple ceremony, because neither of them wanted anything elaborate, and the congregation was small, mostly people from town who'd known Natalie all her life and a few of Kieran's co-workers from the ranch. Mrs. Patterson cried through the whole thing, and even James looked a little misty-eyed when Kieran kissed his bride. Natalie wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and Kieran wore a new suit that made him look almost unbearably handsome. The scar on his face just another part of the man she loved. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, She felt something settle inside her, some piece of herself that had been floating loose, finally finding its anchor. They spent their wedding night in the best room of the boarding house, the one she'd given to Kieran that first day, and it felt right somehow, coming full circle to where everything had started. He was gentle with her, patient, guiding her through the intimacy she'd never experienced before with a tenderness that made her want to cry. And when they lay tangled together afterward, his hand tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder, she felt more complete than she'd ever felt in her life. "I was thinking," Kieran said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion and contentment. "Maybe we could buy a small piece of land, build a house. Nothing fancy, just somewhere that is ours. I could start that horse training business and you could keep running the boarding house if you wanted, or you could do something else. Anything you wanted." "I would like that," Natalie murmured, already half asleep. "A house with a big garden, maybe, and a barn for your horses. And a porch where we could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set." "That sounds perfect." He kissed the top of her head. "You are perfect. I am not perfect. I am stubborn and opinionated, and I snore. You do not snore, and I like that you are stubborn and opinionated. It keeps life interesting." She smiled against his chest, feeling his heartbeat steady and strong under her cheek. "I love you, Kieran Tate. I love you too, Natalie Tate." They saved for 2 years, living frugally and putting away every penny they could spare. Kieran's reputation as a horse trainer grew, and he started getting requests from ranches as far away as Abilene and Wichita. Natalie kept the boarding house running, and she was good at it, good at making people feel welcome and cared for, and word spread until she had a waiting list for rooms. Together, they built a life that was richer and more fulfilling than either of them had imagined possible. In the spring of 1881, they bought 20 acres of land on the outskirts of Great Bend, right where the prairie started to roll into gentle hills. They spent the summer building their house, doing most of the work themselves with help from friends and neighbors. And by September, they were moving into a sturdy 2-story structure with a big kitchen, a parlor with windows that let in floods of light, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Kieran built his barn and his training paddocks, and Natalie planted her garden, and slowly, the place started to feel like home. In December, Natalie discovered she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but she waited to tell Kieran until she was sure, and when she finally did, sitting across from him at their kitchen table while snow fell softly outside, he stared at her in silence for a full minute before standing up and sweeping her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "We are going to have a baby," he said, his voice muffled and thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," she confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. "Are you happy?" Happy does not even begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her, and she saw tears on his cheeks, saw the wonder in his eyes. "I thought when I was sitting in that jail cell in Dodge City that my life was over. I thought I was going to hang for something I did not do, and even if I didn't, I thought I would spend the rest of my life running and alone. And now I have you, and we have a home, and we are going to have a child. It feels like more than I deserve." "You deserve all of it," she said fiercely, taking his face in her hands. "You deserve happiness and peace and a family that loves you." Their son was born in August of 1882, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Natalie's father, and Kieran held him with such careful reverence that Natalie fell in love with him all over again, watching him become a father. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Kieran's business thrived, and he became known throughout Kansas as the man who could gentle any horse, no matter how wild. Natalie sold the boarding house to Mrs. Patterson's nephew and his wife, who'd been looking for a business to run, and she used the money to expand the house, adding on a room that could serve as an office for Kieran, and another room that could be a nursery for future children. In 1884, they had a daughter, Catherine, who had her father's serious demeanor and her mother's fierce independence. Thomas adored her from the moment she was born, and Kieran would often find them playing together in the yard, the toddler teaching his baby sister about the world with the solemnity of a much older child. The years passed, and they were good years. There were hard times, certainly. Droughts that killed crops and made work scarce. Winters that were brutal and left them all feeling cabin-fevered by spring. Moments of doubt and fear that came in the middle of the night when Kieran would wake from nightmares about jail cells and nooses. But they weathered it all together, Natalie and Kieran, partners in every sense of the word. In 1886, when Thomas was 4 and Catherine was 2, a stranger came to the ranch. He was a marshal from Dodge City, and Natalie's heart nearly stopped when she saw the badge on his chest, when she realized he was asking for Kieran by name. She called for her husband, her mind racing through possibilities, through escape plans, through desperate scenarios where they would have to run. But the marshal didn't arrest Kieran. Instead, he told him that they'd caught the actual bank robbers 2 years ago, 3 men who'd been working their way across Kansas committing similar crimes. One of them had finally confessed to the Dodge City robbery, clearing Kieran's name completely. The charges had been dropped, the warrant lifted. He was a free man, officially and legally. Kieran stood there in his yard, his daughter on his hip and his son clinging to his leg, and he looked at the marshal like he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. "I am not wanted anymore. No, sir. You are free to go anywhere you please. No one will be looking for you. I apologize for what you went through. It should not have happened." The marshal tipped his hat to Natalie. "Madam, you have a good day now." After he left, Kieran just stood there, motionless, and Natalie took Catherine from him and sent Thomas inside to play. Then she wrapped her arms around her husband and held him while he shook, held him while 8 years of tension and fear finally drained out of him, held him while he cried for the first time since she'd known him. "It is over," she whispered. "You are free." "I have been free since the day I met you," he said when he could speak again. "But yes, it is over." That night, after the children were asleep, they sat on their porch and watched the stars come out, and Natalie thought about how far they'd come from that first meeting in the boarding house, 2 lonely people who'd found each other against all odds. She thought about the scar on Kieran's face, how she'd touched it and he'd forgotten to flinch, how that single moment had been the beginning of everything. "You ever regret it?" Kieran asked quietly. "Choosing me? You could have married someone easier, someone without a past." She turned to look at him, this man she loved more than she'd ever thought it was possible to love another person. "Not for a single moment. You are the best choice I ever made, Kieran Tate. You and this life we have built together." He smiled, that beautiful smile that still made her heart skip beats and pulled her close. "I love you, Natalie. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. I love you too." They had 2 more children over the years, another son named James in 1888 and a daughter named Rose in 1891. The house filled with noise and laughter, with the sound of children playing and animals and life in all its messy, beautiful glory. Kieran's business continued to grow until he had to hire help, young men from town who wanted to learn the trade, and Natalie started teaching reading and writing to the children of the ranch hands who worked on neighboring properties, finally fulfilling that old dream of being a teacher in her own way. In 1895, when Thomas was 13 and starting to look like a man, he asked his father about the scar. They were in the barn, working on repairing a saddle, and the question came out of nowhere. "Papa, how did you get that scar on your face?" Kieran looked at his son, this boy who was growing up too fast, and he made a decision. He told him the truth, all of it. The horse that had kicked him, the false accusation, the jailbreak, the years of running, the day he'd stumbled into Great Bend more dead than alive, and found a woman who'd saved his life in more ways than one. Thomas listened solemnly, and when Kieran was finished, he said, "So you and Mama found each other because you were running and she was brave enough to help you. That is one way to put it. I think it is romantic, like something out of a story book." Kieran laughed. "Your mother would probably agree with you. She always did like a good love story. You think I will find someone like that someday? Someone who sees past the outside to who I really am? I think if you are half as lucky as I was, you will find someone wonderful. And I think they will be lucky to have you." He put his hand on his son's shoulder. "But take your time, you are young. There is no rush." Over the years, people in Great Bend stopped noticing Kieran's scar. It became just part of him, part of the landscape of a face they all knew and trusted. He served on the town council for a while, helped organize the annual Harvest Festival, became someone people went to for advice about animals or business, or sometimes just life in general. And Natalie, who'd once thought she'd spend her life alone, became known as one half of the most solid marriage in town. A woman who'd taken a chance on a stranger and been rewarded with a lifetime of love. When they'd been married for 20 years, Kieran surprised Natalie with a trip to Topeka for their anniversary. They left the children with neighbors and took the train, acting like newlyweds again, staying in a fancy hotel and eating in restaurants and going to the theater. On their last night, walking back to the hotel under gas streetlights, Kieran stopped and pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of the sidewalk. "What are you doing?" she laughed, aware of people passing by and looking at them with amusement. "I am kissing my wife because I love her and because I can." And he did, thoroughly and publicly, and she kissed him back without caring who saw, because after 20 years, she was still just as in love with him as she'd been that first day when she'd touched his scar and he'd forgotten to flinch. They grew old together, Natalie and Kieran. They watched their children grow and marry and have children of their own. Thomas took over the horse training business eventually, and Catherine married a lawyer in Wichita but came home often with her 3 children. James became a veterinarian and settled in Great Bend, taking care of the town's animals and continuing his father's legacy in a different way. Rose, their youngest, became a teacher, and she taught in the same schoolhouse where Natalie had once dreamed of teaching, fulfilling her mother's lost dream. In 1910, when Kieran was 59 and Natalie was 55, they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, and Kieran reached over and took his wife's hand, lacing their fingers together the way he'd done 1,000 times before. "I have been thinking," he said, and his voice was rougher now with age but still the same voice that had asked her for a room all those years ago, "about how different my life would have been if I had not ridden into Great Bend that day. If I had gone somewhere else, or if you had turned me away, or if a dozen other things had gone differently." "Do you regret any of it?" Natalie asked, even though she knew the answer. "Not a moment. Every step, every mistake, every hard day, it all led me here, to you, to this family, to this life. I would not change a single thing." She squeezed his hand, this man who'd been her partner and her love for over 30 years. "Neither would I." They sat there as the sun set, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, and Natalie thought about how love worked, how it could start with something as simple as choosing to help a stranger, choosing to trust, choosing to be brave. She thought about the scar on Kieran's face, how it had brought him shame and trouble but had ultimately led him to her. She thought about all the years they'd had and all the years still ahead of them, and she felt nothing but gratitude for every single moment. "I love you, Kieran Tate," she said, the same words she'd said 1,000 times, but they never got old, never lost their power. "I love you too, Natalie Tate, now and always." Their grandchildren's laughter rang across the yard, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses whinnied, and the evening breeze carried the scent of Natalie's roses, and it was perfect, all of it. This life they'd built together from nothing but hope and courage, and a love that had started with a simple touch and grown into something that would outlast them both. The years continued to pass, gentle and full. In 1915, they celebrated their 34th anniversary surrounded by their children and grandchildren, a house full of family and noise and love. Kieran was 64 now, his dark hair mostly silver, and Natalie was 60. Her wheat-colored hair faded to white blonde, but they still held hands like newlyweds, still looked at each other with the kind of affection that made their children roll their eyes and smile. That summer, Kieran taught his oldest grandson to work with horses, passing down the knowledge that had defined his life. He was patient and kind, the same way he'd always been with animals and people both, and watching him with the boy, Natalie felt her heart swell with pride and love for this man she'd married. This man who'd come into her life scarred and running and had become her whole world. They lived to see the automobile become common in Great Bend, lived to see the town grow and change in ways they could never have imagined when they'd first met. But some things stayed the same. Their house on the edge of town, with its big garden and the barn where 3 generations had learned to work with horses. The porch where they sat every evening, weather permitting, and watched the sun go down. The way Kieran still looked at Natalie like she was the most remarkable woman he'd ever met. And the way she still touched his scar sometimes, absently. A gesture of affection and acceptance that had become as natural as breathing. In 1920, Great Bend threw them a party for their 39th anniversary. The whole town turned out because everyone knew the story by now. The cowboy who'd arrived with a scar and a secret, and the boarding house owner who'd loved him anyway. Young couples would ask them for advice, and Kieran would always say the same thing. Find someone who sees you for who you really are, not who they want you to be, and then never take them for granted, not for a single day. And Natalie would add, and be brave enough to reach out even when you are scared. Especially when you are scared. That is when it matters most. One evening in late October of 1922, as they sat on their porch wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, Kieran said, "Do you remember the first time I told you I loved you?" Natalie smiled, remembering. "On the back steps of the boarding house, watching the sunset. You said you knew it was too soon, but you could not help it. It was not too soon. It was exactly the right time. I think I loved you from the moment you came around that counter and told me I needed a doctor, with that look in your eyes that said you were not going to take no for an answer. And I loved you from the moment you walked through that door, even though you scared me a little. You looked so fierce and so broken all at once, and I knew I was not going to be able to turn you away." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out, and then Kieran said, "I've had a good life, Natalie, better than I ever dreamed possible, and it is all because of you." "It is because of both of us," she corrected gently. "Because we chose each other and we kept choosing each other every day after that." "Fair enough." He kissed her temple, right where his scar began. "I am a lucky man. We are both lucky." Kieran passed away in his sleep in the winter of 1923, And when Natalie woke to find him gone, lying peaceful beside her in the bed they'd shared for over 40 years, she felt like half of herself had been torn away. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over Kansas to pay their respects to a man who'd been known for his kindness and his skill and his unwavering love for his wife. But Natalie did not crumble. She grieved, deeply and truly, but she did not fall apart, because she knew that was not what Kieran would have wanted. She stayed in their house, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, and she told stories about him, about all the years they'd had together, about the love that had sustained them both through everything life had thrown their way. She lived for another 12 years after Kieran died, and they were good years, even without him. She watched her grandchildren grow and start families of their own. She tended her garden and kept the house the way they'd made it together. And every evening, she would sit on the porch and talk to him like he was still there beside her, telling him about her day, about the family, about how much she missed him but how grateful she was for every moment they'd had. In the spring of 1935, Natalie Kane Tate passed away quietly at the age of 80, surrounded by her children. They buried her next to Kieran in the Great Bend Cemetery, and on her headstone, her children had inscribed, "She saw past the scars to the man within and loved him without reservation." Years later, their great-grandchildren would ask about the story of Kieran and Natalie, and their children would tell it. This tale of a cowboy who'd ridden into town running from a past he couldn't escape, and a woman who'd been brave enough to help him, brave enough to love him, brave enough to build a life with him. They'd tell about the scar that ran down his face like a river, and how she'd touched it and he'd forgotten to flinch, and how that single moment had changed both their lives forever. And the family that came after them, all those children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they carried that story forward, a reminder that love could start in the most unlikely places, between the most unlikely people, and grow into something strong enough to last beyond death itself. They'd tell the story and remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is reach out to someone who's hurting, offer kindness to someone who needs it, and trust that love is worth the risk, always, every single time. The house on the edge of Great Bend stood for many years after Natalie died, eventually becoming the home of Thomas and his wife, then passing to their children. The barn where Kieran had trained horses was still there, still used, and sometimes on quiet evenings, people would swear they could hear the sound of a man talking softly to a horse, gentling it, calming it, the way Kieran had done all those years ago. The boarding house where they'd met was torn down eventually, replaced by a more modern building, but the people of Great Bend never forgot what had happened there. Never forgot that it was the place where two lonely souls had found each other and created something beautiful. They told the story to visitors, to historians who came asking about the town's past, and it became part of the legend of Great Bend, this tale of love and redemption and second chances. Because that's what it had been, really. A second chance for Kieran, who'd been running from a false accusation and a past he couldn't change, and a second chance for Natalie, who'd thought she'd spend her life alone, taking care of everyone but herself. They'd given each other the chance to start over, to build something new, to create a future that neither of them could have imagined when they were apart. And in the end, after all the years and all the changes and all the love they'd shared, what remained was the simple truth of two people who'd chosen each other, who'd stood by each other, who'd loved each other so completely that their story became the standard by which all other love stories in Great Bend were measured. People would say, "I want what the Tates had," and everyone would know what they meant. That kind of love, that kind of partnership, That kind of devotion that lasted from the first moment until the last, and even beyond. The scar that had brought Kieran shame became, in the family's memory, something beautiful. It was the mark that had led him to Great Bend, the distinguishing feature that had made him easy to falsely accuse, but had also made him memorable to Natalie. It was the thing she'd touched on that evening when everything changed, the moment when he'd realized that someone could look at him and see not damage or danger, but just a man worth knowing, worth loving, worth building a life with. Their descendants kept photographs of Kieran and Natalie, faded black and white images that showed a tall man with a serious expression and a visible scar, and a woman who stood beside him with her hand in his, her eyes full of love and pride. And they'd look at those photographs and remember that this was where they came from, this love story that had started with a stranger riding into town, and a woman who'd been brave enough to help him. The legacy of Kieran and Natalie Tate was not just in their children and grandchildren, though there were many of those, spreading out across Kansas and beyond. It was also in the way they'd lived, the example they'd set of what love could be when two people were willing to be vulnerable, to trust, to give each other the grace to be imperfect and the support to become their best selves. They'd shown that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours, whose scars you could touch without flinching, whose past you could accept without judgment. And so the story lived on, generation after generation, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, that sometimes the person you're meant to love arrives when you least expect it, looking nothing like what you imagined, carrying burdens you can't understand. And the most important thing you can do is open your heart anyway, take the risk, choose love even when it's frightening, even when it doesn't make sense, even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. Because in the end, love is always worth it. That's what Kieran and Natalie taught everyone who knew them, everyone who heard their story. Love is always worth the risk, always worth the fear, always worth the leap of faith it takes to say, yes, I will help you, or yes, I will stay, or yes, I love you too, now and always. And on quiet evenings in Great Bend, when the sun sets over the Kansas prairie and the wind whispers through the grass, people still tell the story of the cowboy with the scarred face and the woman who loved him. They tell it to their children and their children's children, passing down this piece of local history that has become legend, this love story that reminds everyone that sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage, one gesture of kindness, one touch that says, I see you, and I am not afraid. The scar ran down his face like a river, they say, beginning the story. She touched it, and the cowboy forgot to flinch. And from that moment, everything changed. Two lives that had been separate, lonely and uncertain became one life, shared and full and rich with love. That is how love works when it is real and true. It takes two incomplete people and makes them whole. It takes two separate stories and weaves them into something greater than either could have been alone. And that is the legacy of Kieran and Natalie Tate, the cowboy and the boarding house owner who met by chance in the summer of 1878 and loved each other until death parted them. And even beyond that, in the memories of those who came after and the story that would never be forgotten,